Well, hello, my guitar friends, and welcome back. It's been a couple of weeks since I've done one of these, Christmas break and all that, but we're back at it with number 46 and the solo to Hitch a Ride by Ton Scholz and Boston on my list of the top 50 most underrated, underappreciated, and/or unknown guitar solos of all time. Okay, so here's a scenario for you. Some guy or girl, spends a couple of years making a record in his basement studio, writing, arranging, composing, mixing, playing all the instruments, so on and so forth. He or she hires a drummer and vocalist to put down the drum and vocal parts because he's not the greatest drummer and or singer in the world. And voila, he's created his own album in his basement. Not an extremely uncommon occurrence these days, especially with modern technology. Hell, I have the capability to do such a thing right here behind me. Technological and software advances have reached the point that one can do this without even so much as touching a musical instrument, by using one of these, a MIDI controller. Amazing, really. But back in the early 70s, it wasn't very common at all to record a basement album, let alone have it be successful. But that is exactly what Ton Scholz did. And not only was it successful, for many years it was the biggest selling debut album in history, selling over 17 million copies, only being usurped by Guns N' Roses' Appetite for Destruction in 1987. Quite an accomplishment, to say the least, and he practically did it all by himself. He had this to say about it in an interview a number of years ago. I think it was very hard for people to wrap their heads around the fact that this band was actually just some guy overdubbing in his basement. They like to think that a band plays together and hangs out together and writes songs together and gets a record contract and goes in the studio and then jam out in the studio and an album comes out of that. This was not like that at all. It was many, many years of long nights playing alone with a tape deck in my basement. Ton Scholz is a hell of a fascinating character. With a master's degree in engineering, he didn't take up the guitar until he was 21 years old. And he also started in around this same time on building his own recording studio in his basement. Coupled with a full-time day job as an engineer with Polaroid, how he found the time to build a studio, learn how to use everything in it, invent new technology that he needed or wanted for his homemade studio, write an album's worth of material, compose and arrange it, learn guitar at a very high level, keyboards and bass, all while playing in a part-time club band is remarkable. A club band, mind you, that he wouldn't dare let touch any of his original material that he was writing at home. It took a few years, of course, to complete his self-made demos, but dedicating oneself just to the level of guitar playing he achieved alone takes years of practice without all that other muck thrown in to distract. By 1975, his demos for the album were complete, and they were so good and well produced that when he was eventually signed by CBS Records after being rejected by nearly everyone else, he wanted to release the demos as the album. CBS disagreed and insisted that he first find a band because as of this point in time, it was just him and lead singer Brad Delp. And CBS wanted them to enter a proper recording studio with an experienced producer and re-record the entire album. Tom agreed to re-record all of the tracks, but he was very reluctant to enter a professional studio. He had everything he needed in his basement and he knew how to use it to achieve the sound for the album that he wanted to achieve. With CBS insisting on recording the album in a professional studio, Tom would not acquiesce, and he got sneaky, and he would go on to record the entire album in his home studio behind his record label's back. CBS hired the producer and the studio, and once Tom had hired some band members, he would send the band members off to record in the big fancy LA studio and just not use the takes. He'd use his own takes that he had put down himself at home. I think that Brad Delp's vocals and the mixing of the album were the only things that they used the professional studio for. The rest was from Tom Scholz's basement. The producer that CBS had hired for the sessions got wise to what Tom was doing and was kind enough to approach Scholz and offer him half of the producer royalties because he knew that Scholz was practically producing the whole album himself anyway. He did not have to do this, and Tom Scholz was extremely pleased with this turn of events. Regardless, upon release of the album, it obviously exploded. Multiple top 40 hits, coupled with the fact that every single song got played on rock radio, every single one of them. And they're still staples of rock radio and classic rock radio to this very day. Every single track from that album. Scholz had crafted a polished, highly produced sound that sounded like nothing else at the time. But the problem with that, if you want to call it a problem, is that the sound was so distinctive that upon the release of their second album, Don't Look Back, in 1978, a short and very rushed release that Scholz wasn't particularly happy with, that Boston was beginning to sound, well, a little too much like Boston, if you know what I mean. Their music was starting to kind of sound the same to some degree. His highly calculated formula for creating that Boston sound had become just that, formulaic, after only 2 albums. Don't Look Back still charted high and produced a couple of hits, including the fantastic title track, but it was short in the extreme at like 29 minutes and musically uneven at times. It would only sell about a third of the numbers put up by the debut album, a sophomore slump, if you will. And as a result of this, Scholz vowed to not rush another album the way he did with Don't Look Back ever again, and it would take another 8 years or so before the world would see another Boston album. At this point, however, most people had either thought that they had broken up, myself included, or just simply forgotten about them. You know, you can't go 9 years without releasing an album, especially in the 70s. Career momentum and touring at this point in rock and roll history was key for most bands to stay successful and in the public eye. And with this 9-year gap between albums at the time, Scholz had pretty much killed that momentum in his effort to get his next album finished his way and only his way, no matter how long it took. That album, Third Stage, released in 1986, failed to put the band back into, pull the band back into mainstream success, at least to the level that they had enjoyed in the late 70s. It did produce one big hit in the soft rock track Amanda, but it really wasn't enough. Just to add insult to injury, prior to this, Scholz was sued for tens of millions of dollars by the band's record label for failing to produce the required 6 albums in 10 years that the band had agreed upon signing their record contract. A legal battle that Scholz would eventually win, actually, albeit accruing nearly $2 million in legal fees, putting the fight to CBS. Much of the profits from his invention of the Rockman portable amplifier would go to pay his legal bills. Anyway, Boston would continue on in this vein for the next 30 years or so, releasing an album every 9 or 10 years, with none of them really leaving much of a mark over the past 30 years. For a band to still be together to this day after nearly 45 years and have only released, I think, 6 albums, that is astonishing. Scholz, I believe, is the only original member left since the unfortunate suicide a number of years back of lead singer Brad Delp. That was sad to hear. Man, that guy had some voice, just incredible. And that's all I got to say. That's your little rock and roll history lesson for today, kiddos. I hope you paid attention there because there will be a test on Friday. Anyway, this solo to Hitch a Ride, I'm of the belief that it is the finest solo that Tom Scholz has ever put down. Thus, of course, its inclusion here on my list at number 46. Tom is a very underrated player, no doubt. He must have been one of those guys who the guitar just came easy to him, like naturally gifted. Because to play at this level after just a few years. Picking the guitar up at like the age of 21 is just incredible. This is not an easy solo to play. Some very quick and tricky bits here and there to wrap one's fingers around. It took me a bit by surprise, actually. But that is not the reason that I chose it. It's the melodies. The solo is just so bloody melodic and well constructed. And when I say well constructed, I mean just that. There's very little about Tom Scholz's playing that could be considered spontaneous or improvisational. Everything he ever recorded is tightly crafted and painstakingly put together and highly polished, including his solos. And the layers upon layers of guitar. I don't know how many layers of guitar he's got going on here, but it is a lot. I used 3 layers to get it somewhat close, but there's some serious multi-tracking and overdubbing going on here. Just an amazing guitar tone as well, and a style that is unmistakably Tom Scholz. Just brilliant stuff. Anyway, that is all I've got to say about that one. Hitch a Ride. I hope you're well in your little guitar corner of the world, and we will see you soon with number 45. You guys take care of yourselves, stay safe, wear your masks, and we'll see you soon. Cheers.